Amara Johnson adjusted the strap of her leather bag as she walked down the jet bridge, heels clicking against the narrow floor with the calm, steady confidence she carried everywhere. The late afternoon flight was bound for New York, and though the day had been long and her meetings exhausting, she looked forward to the few hours of peace that first class promised. The scent of brewed coffee and faint perfume drifted out as she stepped into the cabin, her boarding pass held neatly in her hand. She glanced at the number, Seat 2A. Window her favorite. She allowed herself a small smile. At least she would get to sink into that wide leather seat, sip a glass of sparkling water, and catch up on a few pages of her favorite novel before landing. But the smile faded the instant her eyes found a row. A man, mid-40s, clean-shaven, dressed in a tailored navy suit with a tie slightly loosened, was already sitting in her seat, reclined, scrolling casually through his phone as though he owned the plane. At first, Amara thought perhaps it was a mistake, that maybe she had misread the ticket. But no, the glowing text on the slip in her hand read clearly, 2A. She approached with polite firmness, her voice calm. "Excuse me, sir, I believe that's my seat." He didn't look up immediately. When he did, his expression carried the kind of smirk Amara had seen too many times in her career, dismissive, self-assured, tinged with condescension. "I don't think so," he replied coolly. "This is my seat. Maybe you're confused. Check your ticket again. First class can be tricky." His words were laced with an easy arrogance, as though the idea of her rightfully belonging there was laughable. Around them, other passengers pretended not to listen, but their eyes flicked curiously between the two. Amara held up her boarding pass, steady and clear, showing the seat number. "No, it's definitely 2A." Instead of checking his own ticket, the man chuckled softly and shook his head, his eyes flicking briefly over her polished brown skin and natural curls pinned neatly back. "Well," he said in a tone that made her stomach tighten, "maybe they accidentally upgraded you. These seats usually aren't for everyone." A couple of nearby passengers snickered under their breath, and the flight attendant hovering in the aisle looked caught between uncertainty and discomfort. Amara's chest burned with the familiar sting of insult, an assumption, unspoken but sharp, that she didn't belong, that her place was somewhere else, anywhere but here. She breathed deeply, steadying herself, reminding herself of the patience that had carried her through boardrooms filled with men who had underestimated her time and again. Still, the audacity was infuriating. She extended her ticket again, speaking with measured calm. "This is my assigned seat. Could you please check yours?" But the man only leaned back further into the plush leather, crossing his legs like a king on a throne, phone still in his hand. "Why don't you check with the attendant?" he said lazily, before making a scene. "I'm sure they can find you something more suitable." The words dropped like acid, deliberate and cutting. Amara glanced at the attendant, whose uneasy smile faltered as she glanced quickly at the boarding passes. For a brief, ugly second, Amara could see the hesitation in her eyes, the doubt, as though maybe, just maybe, the man was right. That sting was deeper than the insult itself. Amara stood silently, jaw tight, ticket still in her hand, but her mind already shifting. She would not argue, not yet. She had dealt with men like him all her life, men who thrived on making her small. And if there was one thing she had learned, it was that the louder they tried to silence her, the louder the truth roared when it finally came. She would wait. She would stay calm. But she would not forget. And as the cabin settled and the tension thickened, Amara knew that this flight would be remembered for much more than a stolen seat. The cabin's atmosphere grew heavier by the second as Maya stood frozen in the aisle, her ticket clutched tightly in her hand while the man in her seat leaned back smugly, arms folded like he owned the plane. He was a tall, broad-shouldered white man in his 50s, dressed in a pressed business suit, the kind of man who exuded the arrogance of someone used to getting his way. "Miss, I think you're confused," he said loudly, his voice carrying down the rows. "This is my seat." Maya handed her boarding pass to the attendant, who scanned it again, her face paling when the system flashed green and confirmed Maya's assignment. Seat 2A first class, window side. The attendant turned to the man, politely. "Sir, according to the manifest, this is her seat. May I see your boarding pass?" He waved dismissively, refusing to produce it. I already put my bag up. I'm not moving. Give her another one. The tension between them began to ripple through the first-class cabin as passengers whispered, some pulling out their phones to record. Maya's jaw tightened, her professional composure fighting against the storm of anger rising inside her. She had seen this kind of entitlement before in boardrooms, at conferences, even in restaurants, but it stung sharper here, in front of strangers who now watched her dignity being questioned over something as simple as a paid seat. I'm not confused, she said, her voice steady but firm. Each word clipped with precision. That is my seat, and I will not be displaced. The man laughed under his breath, turning toward the cabin around him. Unbelievable. They let anyone in first class these days, he muttered, loud enough for several to hear. A few gasps followed, a woman across the aisle shaking her head in disapproval, while another passenger raised their phone higher, capturing every moment. The attendant tried again, softer this time, asking him to show his boarding pass. Instead of cooperating, he barked, Look, I paid for this seat, and I'm not about to be told otherwise because she thinks she deserves it. Get her another one or I'll have your job. That word, deserves, clanged in Maya's head like a bell. How many times had she been told in her career that she didn't deserve a seat at the table only to prove them wrong again and again? She wasn't going to move. Not this time. Not ever again. You will show your boarding pass, Maya said suddenly, her voice ringing through the cabin with a commanding authority that startled even the attendant. Or, I will consider this theft and escalate it directly. The man smirked, tilting his head. And who exactly are you going to escalate it to? The captain? Please. Maya's eyes didn't waver. If I have to. The silence was thick, heavy with anticipation. The attendant, trembling between her duty and the passenger's aggression, excused herself to speak with the flight deck. As she walked away, Maya remained standing tall, refusing to let the insult reduce her. She could feel every eye on her, every whisper threading the air like a current, but she didn't shrink. She locked her gaze on the man who had stolen her seat, letting him see that she was not the kind of woman to back down, no matter how public the humiliation. This wasn't just about a seat anymore, it was about respect. The hum of the engines filled the silence as passengers shifted uneasily, their whispers building into a low murmur that spread through the first-class cabin. Phones glowed as people discreetly, or not so discreetly, recorded the confrontation. Sensing it was about to escalate, Maya remained standing, her boarding pass held firmly in her hand like a shield of truth, while the man reclined arrogantly in her seat, as though he had already won. A few rows behind, a woman muttered, "This is ridiculous, why won't he just move?" While another whispered, "She's right, it's her seat." The flight attendant returned quickly, her face tense, and behind her emerged the captain himself, a tall man in crisp uniform with four gold bars on his shoulders. His presence immediately silenced the cabin. Authority radiated from him as he stepped into the narrow aisle, his eyes sweeping over the passengers before resting on Maya. "Ma'am," he began politely, "I understand there's a seating issue here." Maya nodded, handing him her boarding pass. The captain examined it, his brow furrowing slightly as he glanced toward the man in seat 2A. "Sir, I'll need to see your boarding pass as well." The man smirked and leaned back, arms crossed. "Captain, I don't need to show you anything. I paid for this seat. This woman is confused. Just get her another one, so we can leave." His dismissiveness echoed through the quiet cabin, and Maya felt the sting of the insinuation, this woman is confused. How often had people tried to strip her of competence, as if her achievements, her hard work, her very presence were a mistake. But before she could reply, the captain's tone sharpened. "Sir, I wasn't asking. I need to see your boarding pass now." The man huffed, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged, but still refused. "I told you I'm not moving. If you want to delay this entire flight over a seating error, then that's on you." A ripple of unease moved through the cabin, some passengers sighing audibly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The captain stood straighter, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Let me be clear. On my aircraft, No one refuses a crew member's instruction. You will present your boarding pass immediately, or you will be removed from this flight. The man's jaw clenched, his bravado faltering for a fraction of a second. Maya caught it, the small crack in his arrogance, and it fueled her own resolve to stand firm. She said nothing, simply watching, waiting, knowing she didn't need to argue anymore. The truth was already on her side. Finally, with exaggerated annoyance, the man dug into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled boarding pass, tossing it toward the captain. The captain caught it, his eyes scanning the paper. His expression shifted almost instantly. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the cabin, "this boarding pass is for seat 14C, economy class, middle seat." Gasps rippled through the rows, and the man's face flushed crimson. "That's ridiculous," he snapped. "I was upgraded, they just didn't change the ticket." But the captain shook his head firmly. "There's no record of that. You are not assigned to this seat. You attempted to take a seat that does not belong to you, and you disrespected both a fellow passenger and my crew in the process." He turned slightly, gesturing to the attendant. "Call security." The man jumped up then, flustered, trying to regain control. "You can't do this to me. I'm a platinum member. I've flown this airline for 20 years. The captain didn't flinch. "And yet, you forgot the first rule of flying, respect. If you cannot abide by that, you cannot remain on my plane." The cabin buzzed with murmurs, some passengers clapping softly, others shaking their heads in disgust. Maya finally stepped forward, her voice calm and unwavering. "I paid for this seat. I boarded correctly, and I deserve to sit here without being insulted or diminished." For the first time since the ordeal began, the captain turned to her with a respectful nod. "Ma'am, on this aircraft you will—" The man sputtered, demanding to be heard, but security was already being summoned. Maya lowered herself into her rightful seat, her back straight, her eyes fixed forward. The battle wasn't over yet, but the balance of power had shifted. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was the woman who refused to be moved, and now the entire cabin knew it. The murmurs inside the cabin swelled into an uncomfortable hum as the standoff dragged on. The white passenger reclining smugly in the seat that clearly wasn't his, while the black woman executive, Naomi, stood tall and calm in the aisle, refusing to be intimidated. The flight attendants had tried their best to mediate, yet their own bias leaked through in every hesitant word, as if they were hoping she would simply move elsewhere to avoid the trouble. But Naomi wasn't built to shrink. She had fought through boardrooms full of men who had underestimated her, through investors who once dismissed her as too ambitious, and through years of prejudice that tried to cage her dreams, so a seat she paid for was not something she would quietly surrender. The tension finally snapped when a firm voice cut through the noise, one that commanded instant authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The intercom crackled as every head turned toward the front of the plane. "We've been informed of a seating dispute in the main cabin. For safety reasons, we cannot proceed until it is resolved properly." The cabin fell silent. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, realizing the issue they had whispered about was now halting their journey. The captain's voice grew sharper, tinged with disapproval. "Let me make this perfectly clear. Tickets are verified and assigned through official boarding passes. If someone has taken a seat that does not belong to them, they must immediately vacate it, or we will be forced to remove them from the aircraft." A ripple of murmurs swept the plane again, but this time it carried a different energy, one of anticipation, almost relief. Many passengers had silently recognized the injustice, but lacked the courage to speak up. Now authority had spoken and the weight shifted. The man who had stolen Naomi's seat tried to hold his ground, puffing his chest and grumbling about mistakes and confusion, but his voice cracked under the spotlight of the announcement. The flight attendants returned, emboldened by the captain's clear stance, and for the first time, they directed their demand toward the man rather than pleading with Naomi to relocate. "Sir, you need to stand up and return to your assigned seat. Now." The firmness in their tone startled him. Passengers in the nearby rows leaned forward, phones in hand, some recording, others shaking their heads at his audacity. And there was Naomi, still calm, still unshaken, watching it all unfold with quiet dignity. She hadn't shouted, hadn't cursed, hadn't let anger consume her. She had stood in her truth, and now the world was adjusting around her strength. The man, his face flushed with embarrassment, finally rose with exaggerated slowness, muttering about how unfair it was, but no one came to his defense. He slunk back toward his actual seat near the rear of the plane, his false bravado evaporating as passengers' glares followed him down the aisle. Naomi, graceful yet resolute, placed her bag in the overhead compartment and finally settled into the seat that was rightfully hers. The captain's voice returned once more, steady and professional but laced with something that sounded almost like respect. "Thank you for your cooperation. We'll be departing shortly." But for the passengers in that cabin, the flight had already shifted into something unforgettable. The simple act of reclaiming a seat had become a silent triumph, a moment that left them reconsidering not only fairness but the quiet strength it sometimes takes to demand it. As the plane finally lifted into the night sky, the atmosphere in the cabin remained heavy, charged with the aftershock of what had just unfolded. Naomi sat in her rightful seat, composed and serene, though her mind replayed the incident in fragments, the smug smirk of the man, the hesitation of the attendants, the captain's announcement that shifted the balance. She wasn't angry anymore. She was contemplative, quietly aware of how small injustices often revealed larger truths. A flight attendant, now noticeably more attentive, approached with a nervous smile, offering her a complimentary drink for the inconvenience. Naomi accepted it with a polite nod, knowing it was more a gesture of guilt than hospitality. As she sipped, her phone buzzed softly in her lap, and she answered, lowering her voice. "Yes, I'm en route to the conference. The board is expecting me tomorrow morning." A nearby passenger, a middle-aged man in a suit who had been silently observing the ordeal, caught her words and tilted his head, curiosity sparking. Within minutes, snippets of her conversation drifted into the cabin. Acquisitions, partnerships, international deals, numbers in the millions. Whispers rippled through the rows as passengers realized she wasn't just an ordinary traveler, she was a woman of influence, someone operating on a scale far beyond what most could imagine. The same man who had stolen her seat shifted uncomfortably in the back, suddenly aware that the person he tried to belittle was a powerhouse in her own right. When Naomi ended her call, the suited man beside her leaned over respectfully and said, "Pardon me, ma'am, but are you Naomi Carter, CEO of Carter Global?" Heads turned. The name was recognizable. A few passengers gasped, others widened their eyes in recognition. Naomi smiled softly, neither boastful nor defensive. "Yes," she confirmed, "though tonight I'm just another passenger making sure fairness counts." The cabin fell silent for a beat. Then the quiet admiration spread. People weren't just stunned by her title, but by the grace with which she had carried herself. The seat dispute, once a petty squabble, had transformed into a lesson none of them would forget. Respect isn't optional, and dignity always finds its place. From the moment Naomi's identity was revealed, the dynamic in the cabin shifted like a tide turning against a stubborn rock. Where once the arrogant passenger had strutted with entitlement, now he sat slouched in his reassigned seat, his face pale and stiff, eyes darting nervously each time another traveler glanced his way. Whispers trailed up and down the aisles, some in disbelief, others laced with judgment, each one a reminder that his behavior had been publicly exposed. The very attendants who had once hesitated to intervene now moved with renewed purpose, checking in on Naomi with professionalism that felt almost excessive, while giving the man only the most perfunctory service. He tried to call one over for a glass of water, but the delay in response was noticeable, deliberate, even, and the humiliation burned deeper than any words could. Naomi, calm and collected, said nothing to add to his shame. She simply carried herself with an ease that magnified his insecurity. Every polite nod she received, every respectful Miss Carter spoken by crew members reinforced the contrast between them, her quiet power against his loud arrogance. At one point, he attempted a weak defense, muttering to a nearby passenger that it had been a simple misunderstanding, but the man shook his head in disgust and turned away. No one was buying his excuses. The court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. The final blow came when the captain himself emerged briefly from the cockpit, pausing by Naomi's seat to offer his personal apology for the disruption, thanking her for her patience. That single act cemented her position as the respected center of the cabin and cast the entitled man into utter irrelevance. As the flight pressed onward through the dark skies, he shrank smaller and smaller into his seat, wishing he could disappear, while Naomi gazed out the window, serene as ever, her silence louder than any rebuke. When the plane landed and passengers began shuffling out, Naomi rose with unhurried grace, her calm composure standing in stark contrast to the man who had stolen her seat hours earlier. He rushed off the plane, eyes fixed to the floor, desperate to escape the silent stares that followed him down the aisle. Naomi, however, walked slowly, pausing to thank the flight attendants and even the captain once more before stepping into the terminal, her quiet dignity leaving a lasting imprint on everyone who had witnessed the ordeal. The next morning, as she stood at the podium of the Global Business Summit, the very reason she had taken that flight, Naomi chose not to begin her keynote with the usual corporate pleasantries. Instead, she recounted the incident not with anger, but with poise, painting the picture of how a single assumption had escalated into humiliation and how respect and truth had turned the tide. Power, she told the audience, her voice steady and commanding, is not about who can take a seat, it's about who deserves to keep it. The room fell utterly silent before erupting into thunderous applause, not just for her words, but for the weight of the experience behind them. Journalists scribbled frantically, cameras flashed, and within hours her speech had gone viral, becoming a rallying cry against entitlement and prejudice. The man who had stolen her seat might have thought the incident would fade the moment the wheels touched the ground. But instead, it followed him everywhere, his name quietly whispered as a cautionary tale, while Naomi's reputation soared to even greater heights. For her, the ordeal was not about revenge, but about reminding the world that respect cannot be stolen, only earned. Walking off stage to a standing ovation, Naomi knew she had not just taken back her seat, she had turned it into a platform, one that elevated her far above the arrogance that tried to diminish her.